Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to all, depending on your time zone. First of all, I'm thankful to the organizers for giving me an opportunity to present this talk for DebConf 2020. I would also like to acknowledge the team for incorporating the rainbow colors to this year's DebConf logo. I'm John Samuel, and today I would like to talk about building a multilingual command line. The goal of my talk is to look at the current implementations of the command line and explore one way to simplify command line, focusing on natural language interface with multilingual support. Before continuing, I would like to ask the first question. Is command line simple? I would like you to think about the very first days when you started using Linux or other Linux-based systems where, and your instructors told you to memorize some commands to interact with the command line. In the next couple of slides, I would like to show a very small subset of simple and commonly used commands to perform some basic operations for handling files, processes, or networks. Starting with files, I'm very sure that all of you listening to this talk use ls at least once a day. What is ls? It's a command to list files, or possibly a mnemonic to list. This was fine. The first command memorized. Now let's move on to the second command. How can I create a bank file? There are several ways, of course. However, one that's often suggested is touch. How, how can a newcomer ever remember touch? Moving on to the directories, the first command you may have learned was to create a directory. Here comes mkdir. Mkdir coming from two words make and directory, hence the mnemonic mkdir. Now comes this command to change a directory. Going by the logic of the command mkdir, it should be chdir or cgdir, but no, it's cd. I'm wondering after how many repetitions I have memorized these commands. Enough with files and directories, now let's move on to the processes. How can I see all the processes? It's simple, it should be lsp or lspr. But once again, I'm disappointed. It's ps. Okay fine, ps and processes are pretty close. But you do learn that ps is interesting, but it's much better to use top because it can give you a better view of the processes. The man page of top says it displays processes. One may try to associate it with top running processes to memorize this command. Moving on from processes, I wonder lsnet would correspond to see all the network connections. Again, I was wrong. It is netstat. However, I think I was lucky to guess the command for listing all the hardware. Indeed, it is lshw. Again, for CPU, the guess was correct. It is lscpu. But what about the time and date? I was not disappointed and I could memorize this simple command, date. I think it's enough with these different commands. I would like to show you a summary of the commands that we just saw. Is there any pattern that we can see that can reduce the learning curve of the newcomers? We do see that some commands use ls, which can simplify our learning process, but it may not be true for all the commands. As if remembering the commands was not enough and the professors told us about the options. Options? What about them? I want to give examples of some very commonly used options of the command line. -v, is it verbose or is it version? If I type -v with Python or tar, what would be the possible output? What about -r? Is it reverse or is it recursive? And what about hyphen or double hyphen? Okay, for help, is it -h or is it -h or is it -help? A lot has changed since these commands were initially developed. The problems of -h or double -h are now pretty much well handled by a good support from standard libraries. This has helped towards the standardization of commands. I wish to give a couple of examples of the support from standard libraries. For example, in C you have got the functions get opt, get opt long. In Python you have got argparse. These functions or methods can now be used to ensure that there is only one hyphen with the short version, that is -h, and there are two hyphens for the long version of an option, therefore we have double hyphen -l. For example, in C, getOpt_long functions can be used to create commands with short and long options, optional arguments, etc. And in Python, argparse can be used by the developers to create commands with short and long options, one or more optional arguments, specify data types for arguments, subcommands. There are a lot of ways by which further enhancement of command line can be made possible. Most of you have heard about bash, ksh, zsh. There's another shell called fish that incorporates colors to the command line, making a clear visual distinction between commands and their options. Yet we need to see works to add progress bars to visualize the progress of command in action. Currently, it is mostly handled by the command itself. Multilingual documentation has been suggested to help improve the learning curve of the command line users. Unfortunately, this is mostly limited to a couple of languages and a very few commands. This brings me to the second part of my talk. Instead of focusing only on multilingual documentation, what if we ask, but why not multilingual commands and options? What if native language support is brought to the command line where people can write commands in their native languages? But what are multilingual commands? Taking the example of three languages, English, French, and Malayalam, I want to illustrate multilingual commands or imperative sentences to list all the processes. First one, in English, list all the processes. In French, affiche tous les processus. In Malayalam, prakriyagal kanikkuga. Please note that I've highlighted the action verbs in these three sentences. Note their position. Note that the action verb may not come in the first position. Look at the third example. Taking the example of bash, a kind of command line language for Unix or Linux-based systems, let's explore how a shell can be extended to give a multilingual interface. Solution 1. Ask the developers and maintainers to support their tools, applications or commands in multiple languages and release executable in multiple languages. Solution 2. Modify the shell source code to allow accepting translations of existing commands in such a manner that when a user types a command in their native language, the shell searches for the command in all the translations, and if it finds one, checks whether the translation is mapped to any existing command. Solution 3. Extend the shell in a transparent manner that does not require either any modification to the shell nor any modification to the individual applications. Solutions 1 and 2 require a lot of work for translating all the existing commands, their arguments or options. In real life, we do not use all the available commands. Why not take a look at the regular use command and build a transparent multilingual solution using these commands? And this is what brings us to the solution 3, and this is what I'm going to talk in the rest of my talk. Firstly, I want to explore how we can get some inspiration from other domains and their approaches in reducing the learning curve of the newcomers. Let's consider the REST API, or REST Application Programming Interface of web services. The REST architecture style has ensured a lot of simplification in creating new web services and the way by which we can manipulate resources. And when I say resource, I mean online resources like user profiles or associated user data on social networking site. But you can also consider resources on your machines like process, network, files, directories, etc. Interestingly, these are some of the actions or vocabulary popularized by REST web services like create, read, update, delete, list, or simply CRUD-L or CRUD. Continuing with the example of command line, let's see how some of these commands may look like in English. So you have got the action and you have got the resource. So you have create file, read file, update file, delete file, list file, etc. And you can have additional actions like validate file if you are working with JSON files or XML files. And in French, they may look like créer un fichier, afficher un fichier, modifier un fichier, supprimer un fichier, etc. In case of English and French, the imperatives or commands are of the form verb plus subject plus object, where or verb plus object or just verb. However, these imperative sentences follow a different order in languages like Malayalam, as we saw in the previous slide, where the resource comes before the verbs. Thus, the word order cannot be assumed, and it's important to be flexible. And figure 1 shows the first possibility, where the verb comes first and the resources come at the second place. So you have got list and you have got all the resources like files, directories, processes, connections. Now the second possibility is shown in figure 2, where the resource comes in the first place. So you have got files and all the possible actions like create, show, delete, list as a second option. Now, while working with the command line and taking a look at some of the commands that people normally use, we can obtain a list of possible resources and the actions that can be applied on them. For example, you got for resources like directory, network connection, file, processes, memory as a resource on your machine. And you could take a subset of the actions like create, show, delete, and list. For those of you who are further interested in this topic, I would suggest you to take a look at the work of Firefox Ubiquity, which was a project done by Mozilla Labs a couple of years before. So to conclude, we need to have following groups of multilingual commands. In the first group, you have got a multilingual command which consists of an action and a resource. That is, action verbs comes first before the resource. In the second group, the multilingual command consists of a resource and an action. That is, the action verbs comes later after the resource. Finally, in the third group, resources or actions can be in any order. So you have got action plus resource plus options, or resource plus actions plus options. With these groups in mind, we can now move on to the third part of this talk, that is the development of these ideas. Let us explore a very simple way to implement this idea. We want to implement commands as shown in figure 1, where the action verbs comes first and the resource comes in the second place, and as in figure 2, where the action verb comes in the second place. The first solution is a very basic solution, and we are going to use aliases. For testing these commands, you just have to add these commands in your bash rc files in the home directory. The idea is to create a new word combining action words and resources. So you have got 4 aliases here: list file, create file, delete file, and show file, making use of existing commands ls, touch, rm, and cat, which have some of which we have discussed before. And I'm sure many of you listening to this talk have many more complex commands using aliases. The idea here is that the newcomer wants to interact with the command line has to remember only the action verbs, for example list, create, delete, and show, and they can concatenate the resource with these commands. Thus, with a very basic solution of using aliases, the user wishing to manipulate directories can simply write list directory, create directory, delete directory, show directory, etc. However, some may see the presence of big commands like list directory, create file not as a very interesting approach, since these words do not exist in the dictionary. So we may wish to create commands that are close to human language. So the second approach is to separate action words and resources, so that the user can run the following type of commands: create space directory space dir1, show directory dir1, delete directory dir1, create file dir file1, show file file1. So the next solution is based on functions. As you can see, we have written a function called delete actions, and it has got two resources, file and directory. We are also making use of two existing commands, rm and rm directory. Got an alias called delete. So this code shows how alias can be used to call a function. Though we are using a way to delete files and directories, it can be used similarly for working with network connections, processes, etc. Now, with the above code, we can run the following commands: delete space directory space dir1, delete space file space f1. But what if we want to repeat the same process for the French language? So we have got this function called supprime action, and as you can see that the code is similar to the one that we saw for the English language, but we have replaced the action words and resources by the translations in the French language. So now we can run the following commands in the French language: supprimer répertoire rep1, supprimer fichier f1. But what if we want to repeat this for Malayalam? If you remember, in the case of Malayalam, the resource comes in the first position. Hence, there is a slight change in the code. Notice how we have created a function for manipulating directories, that is, the creation and deletion using mkdir and rm directory. So we have got the resource. In this case, we have the directory, and we have got the two actions, creation and deletion. With these functions, we have succeeded in creating multilingual commands transparently using the existing commands. You may ask that these are very long commands, but what about shorter commands and options? As you may observe that the function that has been created before is modified in this current slide to create shorter options. So what if you want to have more options? Yes, it's possible. You can make use of the count variable to get the count of options and arguments, and you can use $1, $2, $3, etc. to handle each argument. Here we see shorter commands for the French users. Recall that the French users can easily associate S with supprimer or delete in English, F with fichier or file in English, R with repertoire directory in English. So we have got the commands srrep1, sff1. Finally, I've come to the final part of my talk. What can be the possible role for the Debian community in the future? Because there are 7,000 languages, and even if we decide to focus only on 100 to 300 languages with the most number of speakers, it is difficult to ensure the development translation of all commands, tools, and documentation. Sharing and collaboration is the way to ensure greater availability of multilingual commands. The users can develop command line configuration files for the language or languages by making use of the existing commands as discussed in this presentation. They can share these multilingual configuration files with other users using open source licenses. And finally, the Debian community can imagine collaborating towards a flexible solution which not only promotes multiple commands and tools but also ensures the flexibility to the users in choosing their favorite commands. There are several possible ways by which a multilingual command line can be built. This possible transparent solution discussed in this presentation may be helpful to reduce the learning curve of the students who are very new to the command line. There are efforts like OSQuery that aim to simplify the command line using Sparkle-like commands. Some researchers have been exploring a natural language interface for the command line, but these works are focused on English language and do not consider the linguistic diversity of the world. Finally, future open source solutions need to be multilingual by design. These are some of the references for this talk. You can take a look at the .files repository that I created recently. If you are interested, you can contribute to it or you can share your own to the open source community. Thank you once again for listening to my talk and giving me this opportunity. I hope that this talk may inspire current and future open source contributors, especially bilingual or multilingual contributors, to develop multilingual solutions. If you have any questions or remarks, or if you want to point to some interesting works, please do not hesitate to contact me. Thank you.